All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping into something that I think a lot of our listeners will find, well, a little bit provocative. We're going to be talking about political realism. And, for those of you who maybe tend towards a more optimistic, cooperative view of the world, realism can sometimes feel a bit jarring.
Yeah, it's definitely a school of thought that doesn't shy away from, the harsher realities of international politics, kind of like a splash of cold water on any overly idealistic notions about how states interact with each other. Especially for a philosophical mind like yours, it raises some really fundamental questions about human nature itself.
Yeah, and thinking about this from a philosophical perspective, it really gets you thinking about, what are the fundamental building blocks of how we understand the world?
Mm-hmm.
If we're looking at this through a realist lens, are we essentially saying that conflict is inevitable? That, this drive for power is something inherent in us?
Well, that's a core question that realists grapple with, right? And I think one of the key takeaways is that, they see states, countries, as the main players on the world stage. And these states are driven by primarily two things: security and what they define as their national interests. And, in a world where there's no global authority, no world government to keep everyone in check, each state is ultimately responsible for its own survival.
It's every nation for itself, basically.
Yeah, you could say that. And that's where this whole notion of power becomes central, right? Because, in the absence of a higher authority, power becomes the ultimate currency. It's how states protect themselves. It's how they pursue their interests.
So it's almost like this self-help system writ large.
Precisely. It's like everyone's looking out for number one, and in this case, number one is the state itself.
Okay, so where does that leave, morality and ethics in all of this? Is it a case of, check your morals at the border when it comes to international relations?
Yeah, that's a common misconception. And to be fair, in some of the more extreme versions of realism, that might be the case. But it's important to make a distinction, I think. Classical realism, which we'll get into a bit later, the kind championed by folks like Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau, they definitely emphasize national interest, right? But they didn't necessarily just toss ethics out the window.
So it's not a completely amoral perspective?
Not necessarily, no. They were more cautious about, I guess you could say, abstract moralizing that didn't really grapple with the realities of power, the messy realities of how states actually interact. They believed in being pragmatic. For them, I think a key ethical consideration was often prudence, judging the best course of action based on its likely political outcomes.
Okay, so it's like a more, I guess, practical approach to ethics,
Yeah.
One that takes into account the kind of the rough and tumble world of international politics. And this isn't, some brand new idea that just popped up. We're talking about a tradition that goes way back.
Oh, absolutely. You can trace elements of realist thought back centuries, to ancient thinkers like Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes. And then, of course, in the 20th century, particularly after the two world wars, classical realism really came into its own. And later on, we saw the rise of neorealism, which tried to be more scientific and focused on the structural dynamics of international politics. And, these different schools of thought, they're still being debated and reinterpreted today.
Right. So for you, dear listener, our mission today is to kind of delve into those fundamental assumptions that underpin political realism, and then to kind of trace its evolution as a philosophical perspective, really, on international affairs. So let's start with our first stop way back in ancient Greece with Thucydides.
Perfect place to start, really. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, gave us this incredible work, The History of the Peloponnesian War. Now, it's not exactly, a systematic work of political philosophy like, say, you get from Plato.
Right, more of a historical account.
Yeah, exactly. But it's so rich with insights into the dynamics of power politics, the way states behave, under pressure, the decisions they make when the stakes are high. You can glean some core realist ideas from it, even though Thucydides himself may not have explicitly labeled them as such.
Right, and those realist interpretations of Thucydides often center around those specific episodes in his history, right? The Athenian speeches, the Manilian dialogue.
Precisely. realism as a theoretical framework draws heavily from how Thucydides portrays those arguments, the way the Athenians acted, their justifications for their actions. Like in that pre-war debate in Sparta, the Athenian envoys flat out say that considerations of justice have never turned people aside from the opportunities of aggrandizement offered by superior strength. It's a very stark way of saying that when you have power, when you have the upper hand, you can essentially dictate what's right, especially in a world where there's no one to enforce any kind of universal morality.
So it's that idea kind of laid bare, that self-interest, especially when backed by power, often trumps any kind of moral considerations.
Exactly. And then there's this whole notion of anarchy, right, that runs throughout Thucydides, which, again, doesn't mean chaos necessarily, but rather the absence of a global government. No one to set the rules and make everyone play by them. And in that kind of self-help environment, as the Athenians, rather bluntly tell the Melians, the independent states survive when they are powerful.
So it's this constant focus on security. You got to look out for yourself because no one else is going to do it for you.
Exactly. And that leads states to build up their power, to engage in power balancing. It's this idea that, if one state gets too strong, others are going to band together to try to counterbalance that power, either through alliances or by increasing their own military capabilities.
We've seen that play out throughout history, haven't we? The rise and fall of empires, the shifting alliances, all these efforts to prevent any one state from becoming too dominant.
Absolutely. And Thucydides gives us a prime example of this in his analysis of the underlying causes of the Peloponnesian War. He points to the growth of Athenian power and the fear this instilled in Sparta. You can even draw parallels to what we see today with the anxiety surrounding China's rise and the potential for conflict with the U.S., as the established power. It's like this recurring pattern in history. Some scholars even call it the Thucydides trap. That's where a rising power challenges the dominant one, and the fear and insecurity this creates often leads to conflict.
That's like a classic power struggle writ large on the global stage.
Exactly. And another key episode from Thucydides that realists often point to is the Melian dialogue, right?
Yeah, the Melian dialogue.
It's almost a textbook example of this tension between power and morality in international relations. It's this incredibly stark portrayal of the realist worldview in action.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What exactly happened in the Melian dialogue?
All right, so picture this. It's 416 BCE. Athens is this powerful empire, right? And they demand the surrender of this small neutral island called Melos. The Athenian envoys basically tell the Melians to forget about any appeals to justice, to focus on their survival because, they're outnumbered, they're outgunned. And they say this very famous line. Decisions about justice are made in human discussions only when both sides are under equal compulsion, but when one side is stronger, it gets as much as it can, and the weak must accept that.
It's such a brutal assessment, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It cuts right to the core of the realist argument. Basically, they're saying that might makes right, especially in the absence of any kind of higher authority to enforce justice. It's a very hard-nosed, power-centric view of international relations.
And the Melians, they try to appeal to, ideals of justice, fairness, right? They even suggest the gods will be on their side.
Oh, absolutely. They make these impassioned pleas for their independence. They talk about their alliance with Sparta. They believe in mutual obligations between states, the inherent unjustness of aggression. But they're relying more on hope and principle than on any kind of real military strength.
And the Athenians just shut it down. They're like, look, this is about power, about survival. You need to be realistic.
Exactly. And from a purely strategic perspective, the Athenian position, as cold as it is, makes a certain kind of sense. They're acting in what they perceive as their own best interest, trying to eliminate a potential threat, however small. But it's interesting because while Thucydides presents their arguments very powerfully, he also shows how this kind of unchecked power, how this pursuit of power for power's sake can ultimately lead to overreach and can actually harm even the powerful state. And he demonstrates this with the disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily that followed the subjugation of Melos.
So are you saying that Thucydides, while presenting this stark realist perspective, isn't necessarily endorsing it wholeheartedly?
Yeah, I think that's a common interpretation among scholars. He seems to be offering a more nuanced perspective. It's almost like he's presenting this case study, right? Or even a cautionary tale about the dangers of both naive idealism as embodied by the Melians and this kind of unrestrained cynicism and pursuit of power, as demonstrated by the Athenians.
It's almost like he's saying there needs to be a balance, right? You can't just ignore the realities of power, but you also can't completely abandon moral considerations.
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading of Thucydides. And this is where he seems to prefigure some of the ideas we see in later classical realists, right? They recognize that national interest is paramount, but they also acknowledge the importance of moral judgment, of prudence in political action. It's not that completely amoral realpolitik that we see emerge much later.
It's like they're trying to grapple with the complexities of ethics in a world where power plays such a dominant role.
Exactly. And speaking of grappling with those complexities, our next stop on this realist journey takes us to Niccolo Machiavelli, a figure who I think it's safe to say really shook things up in terms of how we think about morality and politics.
Machiavelli. Yeah, he's often seen as like this ultimate political pragmatist.
Right. And often misunderstood, I think. Before Machiavelli, you had this dominant worldview shaped by the ancient Greeks, the Romans, Christian thinkers that emphasized virtue as essential for good governance, both within states and in their relations with each other.
So, this idea of ethical leadership, moral constraints on power, a sense of justice informing political decisions.
Exactly. Cicero, for example, had a huge influence on this. He developed this whole concept of natural law, a set of universal moral principles that should apply to everyone, including in times of war.
Right. And Machiavelli comes along and basically says, hold on a minute, let's get real here.
Yeah, he really threw a wrench in the works. Machiavelli was writing in the early 16th century, during a period of intense political upheaval in Italy. And in The Prince, he famously states that his goal is to consider, as he puts it, the effectual truth of the thing rather than the imagination thereof. What he meant was the only truth that matters in politics is what works, what actually leads to the security and prosperity of the state, not some idealistic notion of how things ought to be.
So he's prioritizing pragmatism over abstract moral principles.
Exactly. And he even redefined this key concept of virtue, right? The ancient Greeks had this idea of our aturat moral excellence. But Machiavelli's concept of virtue was something different. It was more about skill, strength, the ability to acquire and maintain power, even if it meant doing things that, traditionally would be considered immoral.
So it's about effectiveness, about achieving your political goals, regardless of the moral cost.
Right. And that leads us to the concept of Machiavellianism, which often gets used interchangeably with this term realpolitik. It's that really radical form of political realism that basically denies the relevance of ethics in political decision-making. The ends justify the means.
So the idea of raison d'etat, the reason of state, that the survival and the interests of the nation trump all other considerations.
Exactly. And while Machiavelli himself acknowledged that some of the actions that might be necessary for the state could be considered evil, in other contexts, he justified them. It was his later followers, like Hegel and Treitschke in the 19th century, who really took this idea and ran with it. They developed this notion of a double ethics, one set of moral principles for public life, another for private life.
It's like saying morality is for individuals, but the state operates according to a different set of rules.
Exactly. And they argued that the state's self-preservation, its survival becomes the highest moral duty, which is really, taking realpolitik to its logical extreme.
And we've seen the dangers of that kind of thinking play out in history, haven't we? The justification of wars, conquests, even atrocities, all in the name of national interest.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope for sure. While Machiavelli, is praised for his political insights, for his advocacy of republicanism, there's also this view that he bears some responsibility for this demoralization of European politics. While these kinds of amoral arguments had existed before him, he really gave them a powerful and persuasive justification.
It's almost like he provided the intellectual framework for leaders to act ruthlessly, to pursue their goals without any real moral constraints. And this brings us to another key figure in the realist tradition, Thomas Hobbes, who famously wrote about the anarchic state of nature. Mm-hmm. What was his contribution to realist thought?
So Hobbes was writing in the 17th century, right, amidst the chaos of the English Civil War. And he was really influenced by the rise of modern science. He wanted to understand politics in a more, scientific, rational way. And he broke with the traditional view of humans as inherently rational and social creatures.
Yeah, the classical view that we're all basically good, or at least capable of being good.
Right. Hobbes had a much more, let's say, pessimistic view of human nature. His famous quote is that life without government is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Doesn't sound like a very fun time.
Not at all. And that's why he describes the state of nature as this war of every man against every man.
Hmm.
It's a state of anarchy where there's no higher authority to enforce rules, and everyone is essentially equal in their capacity to harm others.
So even if individuals aren't inherently evil, this structure, this absence of order just pushes them into conflict.
Precisely. It's driven by this constant fear, this desire for self-preservation, and this competition for resources. And Hobbes argues that in this kind of environment, it becomes rational to try to dominate others, to secure your own safety.
It's like the best defense is a good offense.
Yeah, or at least, a preemptive strike. You can't trust anyone, so you have to constantly be on guard, ready to defend yourself, and potentially even attack first.
So how does this, this view of the state of nature apply to international relations?
Well, Hobbes primarily focuses on domestic politics, right? On the relationship between individuals and the need for a sovereign state to create order. But his ideas about the state of nature, about this constant potential for conflict, it can be applied to relations between states. Because in the international system, there's no world government. There's no overarching sovereign to keep states in check.
Right. So states are kind of like these individuals in Hobbes' state of nature, constantly vying for power, looking out for their own interests.
Exactly. They may not always be at war, but there's this underlying potential for conflict, this disposition to war, as he calls it, because each state is ultimately responsible for its own survival, and they can't rely on anyone else to protect them.
It's like a never-ending security dilemma. You build up your power to protect yourself, but that makes other states feel insecure, so they build up their power, and the cycle just keeps going.
Precisely. And it's interesting because, Hobbes doesn't actually propose a world sovereign to solve this problem, even though it kind of seems like a logical extension of his argument for domestic order.
So he sees this fundamental difference between domestic politics and international relations.
Yeah. He seems to believe that while individuals need a strong sovereign to escape the state of nature, states themselves can exist in this condition of potential conflict as long as it doesn't escalate into actual war that threatens their survival.
Okay, so where does Hobbes stand on the whole issue of ethics in international relations? Is it all just about power and self-interest, like Machiavelli argued?
Well, he's definitely in that realist camp. He doesn't believe there are any inherent moral limitations on how states behave. But what distinguishes him, I think, is his emphasis on the defensive nature of foreign policy. He doesn't necessarily advocate for states to just go around conquering others for no reason.
So it's a more pragmatic, less aggressive view of realism?
Exactly. He sees peace as being in a state's rational self-interest. Because war is risky, it's unpredictable. And while he acknowledges that states can make treaties, and agree to certain rules, he's also realistic about the fact that they're ultimately going to interpret those rules based on their own interests and their ability to enforce them.
So a degree of cooperation is possible,
right,
but it's always going to be limited by this underlying power dynamic.
Right. And that kind of sets the stage for the rise of 20th century classical realism, which emerges in response to this wave of idealism that followed World War I.
So we had this devastating global conflict, and there was this widespread sense that, we can't let this happen again. We need to find a better way.
Exactly. And this is where you see the rise of these thinkers who are often called liberal internationalists or sometimes even utopians. They believe in the power of reason, of international law, of organizations like the League of Nations to create lasting peace.
Right. So it's about cooperation, collective security, finding common ground to prevent future wars.
Yeah. They emphasize the shared interests of humanity, the potential for progress. They believe that war is this aberration that we can overcome through education, through cooperation. But this view, it faces some pretty harsh critiques.
Because the reality of international politics often doesn't live up to those ideals.
Yeah. Thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr and E.H. Carr, they start pointing out the flaws in this idealistic perspective. And then, of course, you have the ultimate failure of the League of Nations to prevent World War II.
Which really shatters that sense of optimism.
Right. It shows the limitations of this kind of idealism, of this faith in international institutions to solve the problem of war. And so in the aftermath of World War II, you see this shift towards realism.
The more pessimistic, perhaps more jaded view of international relations.
Yeah. It becomes the dominant paradigm. And it's during this period that you have these key classical realists emerge. Folks like John Hurst, Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, Raymond Aron, they offer this much more skeptical, power-centric view of the world. And later, of course, you have neorealism developing, which tries to make realism more scientific, more rigorous.
Right, which we'll get to in a bit. But first,
Yeah.
let's dig into those classical realists. Let's start with E.H. Carr and his critique of idealism in his book, The 20 Years Crisis.
Right.
What were his main arguments against this idealistic worldview?
So Carr was writing in 1939, right on the eve of World War II. And in the 20 Years Crisis, he launches this really scathing attack on what he calls utopianism, which is his term for this kind of idealism. And he argues that it's based on this naive faith in reason, in the inevitability of progress, this kind of self-righteous moralizing that often ignores the realities of power.
Right, so he sees this gap between how states actually behave and these idealistic principles of international cooperation.
Exactly. And he's particularly critical of this notion of a harmony of interests, the idea that what's good for one state is good for all.
Like, we're all in this together.
Right. But Carl says, no, that's not how the world works. He sees it as this doctrine used by the powerful to maintain their dominance. And he argues that morality itself is relative. It's not universal, is shaped by the specific interests of different actors.
So the powerful get to define what's right, what's just.
That's essentially his argument. He says that politicians use these lofty ideals, like justice, peace, to mask their own national interests. And he even goes so far as to suggest that, these universal values that the idealists talk about, they're really just tools used by the powerful to preserve the existing order, an order that benefits them.
So it's all about maintaining the status quo.
Right. He even goes so far as to say that the best way to achieve peace in the absence of, a global enforcer is to appease the dissatisfied powers, to give them what they want so they won't disrupt the existing order.
Which sounds a lot like, the appeasement policies of the 1930s, which, as we know, didn't exactly work out so well.
Yeah, and Carr gets a lot of criticism for that, for not recognizing the inherent danger of a power like Nazi Germany. And it shows that these theories of international relations, they're not just abstract ideas. They have real-world consequences. They shape how policymakers think, how they make decisions. And in the case of the 1930s, this realist skepticism towards collective security, towards the League of Nations, it arguably contributed to the weakness of those institutions and to the ultimately disastrous policy of appeasement.
So Carr was a realist who saw through the illusions of idealism, but he also perhaps failed to fully grasp the true nature of the threat that was emerging.
Right, and that's a cautionary tale for any theory, the danger of becoming so wedded to your framework that you miss the specificities of the situation.
So building upon this critique of idealism, we have Hans Morgenthau, another key figure in classical realism. What were the central tenets of his theory?
So Morgenthau, he was deeply influenced by thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr, who we mentioned earlier, and also Thomas Hobbes. And he developed this very comprehensive theory of realism in his book, Politics Among Nations. And at the core of his theory is this concept of power. He famously said that international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. And he believed this was rooted in human nature itself, this inherent desire to dominate others, what he called animus dominandi.
So it's not just about, the structure of the international system. It's something deeper, something psychological, something inherent in who we are.
Yeah, that was his view. And he developed these 6 principles of political realism to flesh out this theory, right?
6 principles. Okay, let's break those down.
So the first principle is that realism is based on objective laws. He's trying to ground his theory in something that's rooted in human nature, something unchanging, something that explains why states behave the way they do, regardless of, their particular leaders or ideologies.
Okay, so universal explanation.
Right. And the second principle is that the key concept in international politics is interest defined in terms of power. And this is really central to Morgenthau because he argues that by focusing on this, on how states define their interests and how they use power to pursue those interests, you can cut through all the noise, all the rhetoric, all the ideological justifications, and get to the core of what's driving their actions.
So it's like a way to simplify a very complex world.
Exactly. He's saying that at the end of the day, states are rational actors. They're trying to maximize their power, their security. And the third principle acknowledges that, while this concept of interest defined as power is universal, the specific content of those interests can vary. Different states will have different priorities, different goals.
Right, depending on their geography, their history, their internal politics.
Exactly. Now, the fourth principle is where he really gets into the relationship between realism and ethics, which is something we talked about earlier. He acknowledges that moral considerations are relevant, but he argues that they must be filtered through the concrete circumstances, the realities of power.
It's that pragmatism again.
Yeah, and he famously says that there can be no political morality without prudence, which is that idea of carefully considering the consequences of your actions, not just acting on some, abstract moral principle. And his fifth principle is that states should act based on this prudence, not on some belief in their own moral superiority. They need to understand that other states are also pursuing their interests, and they need to find ways to coexist.
Right, so don't go around imposing your values on others.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the legitimacy of other states, even if you disagree with their actions. And his sixth principle is that politics is this autonomous sphere. It's not subordinate to ethics. But he's not saying ethics are irrelevant. It's more about finding that balance. He famously said that a purely political man is a beast, while a purely moral man is a fool.
So it's like you need both, right? You need to be able to understand and wield power, but you also need to have some sense of moral compass.
Yeah, it's about finding that difficult balance. But even though Morgenthau's theory is very influential, it also gets a fair amount of criticism.
What are some of the main critiques of his classical realism?
One big criticism is that, this idea of an inherent lust for power in human nature, it's more of an assumption than a proven fact.
It's hard to empirically test, the inner workings of human motivation.
Exactly. And then there's this critique that, by defining rational foreign policy as maximizing power, you're kind of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. States might start acting that way because that's what the theory expects of them.
Like if you tell them that power is the only game in town, then that's the game they're going to play.
Right. And Raymond Aron, who we mentioned earlier, another big thinker in international relations, he also criticized Morgenthau's concept of power, for being ambiguous. Is it a means or an end? And if it's just a means, then it doesn't really explain all of state behavior.
Right, because states might be pursuing different ends. Power might just be the tool they use to get there.
Exactly. And he also questions whether, all states really behave the same way. Do democracies act the same as authoritarian regimes? Do different cultures have different approaches to power? It's not always just about this one-size-fits-all struggle for power.
So there's a need for more nuance, for taking into account the different contexts in which states operate.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because while Carr and Morgenthau were focused on international relations, you can also see echoes of their ideas in how we understand domestic politics as well. There's this whole school of thought called New Political Realism that emphasizes the autonomy of politics, the idea that it operates according to its own logic, its own rules, not necessarily according to moral principles.
So a kind of separation between the realm of politics and the realm of ethics.
Right. But it's important to note that this kind of political theory realism, it's a bit distinct from the international relations realism that we've been discussing.
Okay, so different but related.
Exactly. And, despite its influence, classical realism faced these critiques, these ambiguities, and that kind of paves the way for the emergence of neorealism.
So neorealism emerges as this attempt to refine realism, to make it more rigorous, more scientific.
Exactly. And this is happening in the 1950s and 1960s when you have a lot of scholars with backgrounds in, the hard sciences coming into the field of international relations. And they're bringing with them these ideas about, scientific methodology, about testable hypotheses. And they want to apply that to the study of international politics.
So it's a shift away from that more, historical, philosophical approach of classical realism towards something more, I guess, data-driven, more quantifiable.
Exactly. And this creates a big debate within the field, between the traditionalists who favor this more, historical interpretive approach and these new, more scientifically minded scholars.
It's a classic battle between different ways of knowing, different ways of understanding the world.
Yeah. And, the field of international relations starts to divide into these different camps. The traditionalists, the positivists, and later the post-positivists who kind of offer a critique of both. But despite these methodological differences, most realists still agree on the importance of the state as the main actor and the centrality of conflict and competition.
Okay, so the focus on power and conflict remains, but how they study it, how they explain it, that's what's changing.
Right. And then, in the 1970s, you have this interesting development. The Cold War seems to be easing a bit. You have the rise of non-state actors, NGOs, terrorist groups, and there's this growing sense of interdependence, with globalization and all that.
So the world seems to be getting more complex, more interconnected.
Exactly. And this leads to a bit of a resurgence of, more idealistic thinking, particularly this school of thought called neoliberalism, which emphasizes cooperation and the role of international institutions.
It's almost like a return to that post-World War I idealism, but with a more sophisticated understanding of how the world works.
Right. Thinkers like Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, they come up with this concept of complex interdependence, arguing that these growing ties between states are creating new opportunities for cooperation, for mutual benefit.
So it's not just about zero-sum competition anymore. There's potential for win-win scenarios.
Exactly. And this is the context in which neorealism emerges.
So it's a response to both those methodological debates within realism and to this resurgent liberalism.
Exactly. It tries to offer a more scientifically rigorous and theoretically elegant version of realism. And the key figure here is Kenneth Waltz. His book, Theory of International Politics, is kind of the Bible of neorealism.
And Waltz, he shifts the focus away from human nature.
Yeah.
Right? He's not so interested in this inherent lust for power.
Right. He moves the level of analysis to the structure of the international system. He's arguing that it's the structure that shapes state behavior, not their internal characteristics or the personalities of their leaders. He even uses this analogy to microeconomics. States are like firms in a market competing for survival.
So it's all about the incentives and constraints created by the structure of the system.
Exactly. And he argues that both classical realists and liberals make the mistake of focusing too much on individual states and not enough on the system itself. And he defines the structure based on three key elements: anarchy, the fact that there's no world government, the nature of the units, which for him are primarily states, and the distribution of capabilities or power among those states.
So anarchy creates this self-help system where states have to look out for themselves.
Yeah.
And the distribution of power determines who has the upper hand.
Precisely. And because of anarchy, Waltz argues there's this constant potential for conflict, this security dilemma that we talked about earlier. States build up there.